Try something right now if you're able to. Stand up, lift one foot slightly off the ground, and just balance on the other for a few seconds. Now do it again, but this time, curl your toes upward, lifting them off the floor entirely while you balance. Notice the difference. Notice how much harder it suddenly becomes, how much more your ankle wobbles, how much more your whole body has to compensate just to stay upright. That small experiment you just did reveals something most people never think about, something that has almost nothing to do with strength, almost nothing to do with how fit you are, and almost everything to do with a part of your body that gets treated as practically decorative, your toes. Today I want to walk you through exactly what your toes are actually doing every time you stand, every time you walk, every time you catch yourself before a stumble, and what happens to your balance, your stability, and eventually your risk of falling when your toes stop doing the job they were built to do. Let's start by correcting a misconception almost everyone holds without realizing it. Most people think of toes as essentially passive, decorative extensions of the foot, useful mainly for fitting into shoes and occasionally stubbing painfully against furniture. But your toes, particularly your big toe, are active, load-bearing, sensory-rich structures that play a direct, measurable, and surprisingly large role in your ability to balance, to push off effectively when walking, and to make the kind of split-second stabilizing adjustments that prevent a stumble from turning into a fall. Your big toe alone, often referred to in podiatric and biomechanics research as the hallux, bears a disproportionately large share of the load and propulsive force generated during the final phase of each step you take, sometimes estimated to account for somewhere between 50 and 60% of the total push-off force generated by your entire forefoot. This is not a minor structural detail. It means that one single digit, often the one we think about least, is doing one of the most mechanically important jobs in the entire process of human walking. Now let's talk about balance specifically, because this is where the story becomes genuinely fascinating, and where most people have absolutely no idea what's actually happening beneath their own feet every second they're standing upright. Human balance depends on a continuous, largely unconscious feedback loop between your nervous system and several sensory inputs, your inner ear's vestibular system, your vision, and a category of sensory information called proprioception, your body's ongoing, moment-to-moment awareness of where its various parts are in space and how much pressure and tension they're experiencing. A huge concentration of proprioceptive sensory receptors exists in the skin, joints, and tendons of your feet, and a disproportionately large share of that sensory density is located specifically in your toes. Your toes are, in a very real sense, acting as a sophisticated pressure and positioning sensor array constantly feeding information up through your nervous system about exactly how your weight is distributed across the ground beneath you, in real time, dozens of times per second. This is why the simple experiment we started with, curling your toes up off the ground while balancing, makes such an immediate and dramatic difference. You're not removing any muscular strength by doing that. Your leg muscles, your ankle, everything else remains exactly the same. What you're removing is an entire stream of sensory information that your nervous system relies on to make the constant micro-adjustments required to keep you upright. Without that toe-ground contact, your brain is suddenly trying to balance your entire body with a significant portion of its sensory feedback simply missing, which is precisely why your ankle starts wobbling and your whole body has to work so much harder to maintain the exact same task it was handling effortlessly a moment before. Let's get specific about what's actually happening mechanically when your toes are healthy and functioning properly during normal standing and walking. When you stand still, your toes are continuously making tiny, largely imperceptible gripping and pressing motions against the ground, motions you're almost never consciously aware of, that help fine-tune your center of pressure and prevent the kind of larger postural sway that would otherwise require bigger, more obvious corrections from your ankles, knees, and hips. This is sometimes referred to by researchers studying postural control as a key component of what's called the ankle strategy, one of the primary mechanisms your body uses to maintain balance during quiet standing, and the toes are a critical, often overlooked contributor to that strategy's effectiveness. During walking specifically, your toes perform an additional, equally important role during what's called the push-off phase, the final part of each step where your weight has shifted forward onto the ball of your foot and your toes, particularly your big toe, flex and press against the ground to generate the forward propulsive force that carries you into your next step. A toe that isn't functioning properly, whether due to weakness, stiffness, or structural deformity, generates measurably less push-off force, which forces other muscles further up the kinetic chain, your calves, your hips, to compensate, often inefficiently, throughout the rest of your walking gait. Now let's talk about why toe function actually declines for so many people, because this isn't simply an inevitable, unavoidable consequence of getting older the way some aspects of aging genuinely are. A huge contributor is decades spent in footwear with narrow, tapered toe boxes, the front portion of a shoe, which gradually compresses the toes into a position significantly narrower than their natural, unconstrained alignment. Over enough years, this chronic compression doesn't just risk structural deformities like bunions, which we've discussed in the context of foot aging more broadly, it also functionally weakens the small intrinsic muscles within the foot that are responsible for actively controlling and stabilizing the toes during standing and walking. These muscles, when toes are essentially locked together and immobilized inside a narrow shoe for 10 or more hours a day across decades, simply don't get the opportunity to work through their natural range of motion. Unlike any muscle that isn't regularly used through a full range, they gradually weaken and lose some of their functional capacity, a process sometimes described in physical therapy literature as a kind of disuse atrophy specific to the small muscles of the foot. There's a particularly important muscle worth understanding specifically, called flexor hallucis brevis, along with several other small intrinsic muscles that directly control the fine movements of your big toe. These muscles are responsible for that active gripping and stabilizing function we discussed, the continuous tiny adjustments your toes make during standing and the powerful push-off force they generate during walking. When these muscles weaken from years of disuse inside restrictive footwear, the big toe's ability to actively participate in balance and propulsion declines correspondingly, even if the toe itself looks structurally normal and shows no obvious deformity. This is part of why toe strength assessments, increasingly used by physical therapists and researchers studying fall risk in older adults, often reveal significant weakness even in people whose feet appear visually unremarkable, because the decline is functional and muscular, happening at a level you simply can't see by looking at your foot, rather than being visible the way a bunion or hammertoe would be. This connects directly to one of the more serious and well-studied consequences of declining toe function: increased fall risk in older adults. Falls represent one of the leading causes of serious injury and loss of independence in aging populations, and researchers studying the biomechanics of balance and fall risk have increasingly focused specifically on toe strength and toe flexor function as a measurable, independent predictor of fall risk, separate from more commonly discussed factors like leg strength or vision. Studies measuring toe grip strength, essentially how much force a person can generate by pressing their toes downward against a measuring device, have found meaningful associations between reduced toe grip strength and increased postural sway, slower reaction time to balance perturbations, and higher rates of reported falls, even after accounting for overall leg strength and age. This suggests that toe function isn't simply a proxy for general lower body strength, it's making its own distinct, measurable contribution to balance and fall prevention that's separate from how strong your quadriceps or calves happen to be. I want to walk through exactly why this distinct contribution exists, because it gets back to that sensory feedback loop we discussed earlier. When you experience a balance perturbation, a sudden uneven section of sidewalk, a small trip, a gust of wind while standing, the speed at which your nervous system can detect that disruption and initiate a corrective response depends heavily on how quickly and accurately sensory information from your feet, including your toes, reaches your brain and spinal cord. Reduced toe sensation and reduced toe muscular responsiveness both slow this entire feedback loop down, meaning the time between something going slightly wrong with your balance and your body actually correcting for it stretches out, sometimes by what would seem like a trivially small amount of time, a fraction of a second, but in the physics of an actual fall, that fraction of a second is frequently the entire difference between a minor stumble that's immediately corrected and a fall that results in serious injury. There's also a structural piece worth understanding, related to a condition called hammertoe, where one or more of the smaller toes becomes permanently bent at the middle joint, often as a consequence of the same chronic narrow footwear and muscular imbalance we've already discussed, where certain muscles controlling toe flexion become chronically overactive or shortened relative to the muscles that should be extending the toe back to a neutral position. Once a toe has developed this kind of fixed, bent deformity, it largely loses its ability to make meaningful, productive ground contact during standing and walking, essentially removing that toe's sensory and propulsive contribution from your overall balance and gait system entirely. With multiple toes affected, which becomes increasingly common with age and years of restrictive footwear, a meaningful percentage of your foot's total sensory surface area and propulsive capacity can effectively be taken offline, forcing your remaining functional structures, your big toe if it's still healthy, your ankle, your calf, to compensate for a job that was originally meant to be shared across all 5 toes working together. Let's also talk about something connected to this that doesn't get nearly enough attention, the relationship between toe function and confidence in movement, because this has real downstream consequences beyond the purely mechanical. People who experience declining balance, whether they consciously attribute it to their toes or not, frequently respond by unconsciously narrowing their range of movement, walking more cautiously, avoiding uneven terrain, reducing their overall physical activity level in ways that feel protective in the moment but that, over time, lead to broader muscular deconditioning throughout the rest of the body, creating a kind of downward spiral where reduced confidence leads to reduced activity, which leads to further muscular and balance decline, which further reduces confidence. Addressing toe function specifically, restoring some of that fine sensory and propulsive capacity, has been shown in some balance intervention research to meaningfully improve not just objective measures of postural stability but also subjective confidence in movement, which matters enormously for maintaining an active, independent lifestyle over the long term, particularly in older adulthood. So what can actually be done about this? Because unlike some structural changes elsewhere in the body, toe function responds remarkably well to targeted intervention, even later in life. Toe splaying exercises, where you actively spread your toes apart as wide as possible and hold for several seconds, directly work the small intrinsic muscles responsible for toe positioning and stability, muscles that have often been chronically underused for years inside restrictive footwear. Towel scrunches, using your toes together and scrunch a towel laid flat on the floor, directly strengthen the flexor muscles responsible for that critical push-off and gripping function we discussed earlier. Simply standing barefoot on varied, slightly uneven natural surfaces, grass, sand, gentle gravel, when safely available, provides exactly the kind of varied sensory input and active toe engagement that flat, cushioned, structured modern footwear has largely eliminated from most people's daily movement. And switching to footwear with a genuinely wide toe box, allowing your toes to sit in something closer to their natural, splayed alignment rather than being chronically compressed together, prevents further progression of the muscular weakening and structural deformities that compound this problem over years. People who consistently incorporate toe-specific strengthening work, even just a few minutes several times a week, tend to report measurable improvements in balance confidence within a matter of weeks, and physical therapy research measuring toe grip strength before and after targeted intervention programs has documented meaningful, quantifiable strength gains over periods as short as 8 to 12 weeks, a relatively fast response compared to many other forms of age-related physical decline, which often take much longer to meaningfully reverse, if they can be reversed at all. This responsiveness is part of why toe and foot intrinsic muscle training has become an increasingly common component of fall prevention programs specifically designed for older adults, alongside more traditionally emphasized elements like leg strength and balance training, because the research increasingly suggests that addressing toe function specifically adds a meaningful, independent benefit beyond what general lower body strengthening alone provides. I want to close by bringing this back to that simple experiment we started with, because I think it's the clearest possible demonstration of everything we've just discussed. The moment you lifted your toes off the ground while balancing, you weren't testing your strength. You were testing an entire sensory and propulsive system that operates almost completely below your conscious awareness every single moment you're standing or walking, a system you've likely never once consciously thought about, built around 5 small digits that most people associate primarily with painted nails or stubbed pain rather than with one of the more important, measurable contributors to whether you stay upright or end up on the ground. Your toes have been doing this job, quietly, continuously, your entire life, whether you've ever appreciated it or not. Whether they're still doing that job well depends largely on decades of footwear choices and whether you've ever given them the chance to move, splay, grip, and engage the way they were originally built to. Now you know exactly what that job is, and exactly what it takes to keep them doing it well for as long as possible. I want to add a layer to this that connects toe function to something most people experience without ever realizing the underlying cause, the slight, gradual change in how walking itself feels as people move through their 30s, 40s, and 50s, often described vaguely as feeling less light on their feet, or noticing they're more hesitant on stairs or uneven ground than they used to be. This change is frequently attributed entirely to general aging, to slowing reflexes or declining leg strength, and while those factors absolutely play a role, the contribution of declining toe sensation and toe muscular function is rarely part of that conversation, despite being, according to the balance and gait research we've discussed throughout this video, one of the more specific, measurable, and importantly, modifiable contributors to that broader sense of reduced stability. The reason this distinction matters practically is that general aging, in the sense of cellular and systemic decline, is something we have limited direct control over, but the specific, localized weakening of toe muscles due to decades of restrictive footwear and underuse is something that responds, as we discussed, to fairly simple, targeted intervention. Understanding which piece of the puzzle is modifiable changes how you might choose to spend your limited time and effort addressing it. Let's talk for a moment about how this plays out differently across different populations, because toe function and its relationship to balance isn't experienced identically by everyone. Athletes involved in sports that require frequent direction changes, lateral movement, or significant push-off force, basketball, tennis, sprinting, tend to maintain considerably stronger and more functional toe muscles throughout life compared to people whose primary movement pattern is walking on flat, even surfaces in highly cushioned shoes, simply because their sport continuously demands the kind of forceful toe engagement that more sedentary or moderately active lifestyles rarely require. This is part of why balance and fall risk research consistently shows lower rates of decline in these specific functional measures among lifelong athletes, even into older age, compared to the general population, a finding that supports the broader idea that toe function is something actively shaped by how much demand is placed on it over a lifetime, rather than something that simply declines uniformly and unavoidably for everyone at the same rate regardless of activity history. On the other end of the spectrum, people who have spent significant portions of their adult lives in highly cushioned, structured athletic shoes, even if they consider themselves reasonably active through walking or light exercise, often show somewhat more pronounced toe muscle weakness than expected, because modern cushioned footwear, while comfortable and protective against impact, also tends to do a substantial amount of the stabilizing and shock-absorbing work that the foot's own intrinsic muscles, including those controlling the toes, would otherwise be responsible for. This creates a kind of paradox worth understanding, where the very footwear designed to protect and support the foot can, over years of continuous use, contribute to a gradual deconditioning of the muscles that would otherwise be doing that supportive work themselves. This isn't an argument against supportive footwear broadly, which serves genuinely important protective functions, particularly for high-impact activities, but it is a reason why deliberately incorporating some barefoot or minimally cushioned movement, along with direct toe strengthening exercises, has been increasingly recommended even for people who otherwise wear supportive shoes most of the time, as a way of maintaining the natural strength and function that constant external support can otherwise gradually erode. I also want to address something that comes up frequently when this topic is discussed, the question of whether toe-specific exercises are really worth the time compared to simply doing general balance training, standing on one leg, or other commonly recommended balance exercises that don't specifically isolate the toes. The research on this is genuinely interesting, because it suggests these aren't redundant approaches, they're complementary ones addressing different parts of the same overall balance system. General balance exercises like single-leg stands primarily train your nervous system's ability to integrate and respond to the sensory information it's receiving, essentially improving the processing and reaction side of the equation. Toe-specific strengthening exercises, by contrast, improve the quality and strength of the sensory input itself, along with the propulsive force the toes can generate during the corrective movements your balance system calls for. A balance system that's well trained at processing information but receiving degraded input from weak, understimulated toes is still working with a meaningful handicap, and likewise, strong, functional toes feeding rich sensory information into a poorly trained nervous system also won't produce optimal balance outcomes. The two approaches genuinely work best together, addressing different links in the same overall chain. There's a practical takeaway here worth being specific about, since vague encouragement to do toe exercises rarely translates into anyone actually doing them consistently. A simple, sustainable routine takes only a few minutes and can easily be done while sitting, watching television, or even standing in line. Start with toe splays, spreading all 5 toes apart as widely as possible and holding for 5 to 10 seconds, repeating 10 times, directly engaging those small intrinsic muscles responsible for toe positioning that are so commonly weakened by years of narrow footwear. Follow this with towel scrunches, gathering a small towel laid on the floor using only your toes, repeating for several rounds per foot, which strengthens the flexor muscles responsible for grip and push-off force. Finish, when safely able to, with brief periods of barefoot standing on a slightly varied surface, a folded towel, a thin balance pad, or natural ground like grass when available, which provides the kind of varied sensory input that flat, even, cushioned surfaces rarely offer, helping maintain the responsiveness of those proprioceptive receptors we discussed earlier in this video. Consistency matters considerably more than intensity here. Doing this routine for a few minutes most days of the week tends to produce more meaningful, lasting improvement than doing a longer, more intense session occasionally, largely because the goal is to gradually rebuild both muscular strength and the responsiveness of a sensory feedback system that's been chronically underutilized for years, sometimes decades, and that kind of gradual functional restoration responds best to frequent, moderate stimulus rather than infrequent intense effort. Similar in principle to how most forms of motor learning and neuromuscular adaptation tend to work throughout the body. I want to end with a reframe that I think is genuinely useful, beyond just this specific topic. We tend to think about balance, and about fall risk specifically, as something that's primarily about strength, about having strong enough legs and a strong enough core to catch yourself when something goes wrong. And while that's certainly part of the picture, it overlooks something more fundamental, that you cannot effectively catch yourself from a problem your nervous system hasn't accurately detected yet, and detection depends heavily on the quality of sensory information reaching your brain in the first place. Your toes are one of the most important and most consistently overlooked sources of that sensory information, working continuously, automatically, every single moment you're upright, whether you've ever paid them any attention or not. 5 small digits, doing one of the more underappreciated jobs in your entire body's ability to keep you standing, and now you understand exactly what that job involves, and exactly what it takes to make sure they're still able to do it well, today and for years to come. One last thought worth leaving you with. The next time you slip your shoes off at the end of the day, take 30 seconds and actually wiggle your toes, spread them apart, press them into the floor. Notice whether that movement feels easy and natural, or whether it feels stiff, restricted, almost foreign, like asking a muscle to do something it hasn't been asked to do in years. That simple, 30-second check tells you more about your actual balance and fall risk than almost any other quick self-assessment you could do at home, and it costs nothing, requires no equipment, and takes less time than scrolling through a single social media feed. Your toes have been quietly carrying a disproportionate share of the responsibility for keeping you upright your entire life. The least you can do is give them 30 seconds of attention back.